Will I make a start?
Okay.
Good to make a start? Think so?
Go for it.
Okay, well, a very warm welcome everyone to this afternoon's Community Wealth Building workshop, which EDAS is absolutely delighted to be hosting in partnership with Scottish Government and COSLA. My name's Liz McEntee and I'm Chair of EDAS, and I'm especially pleased to be opening today's event, as having worked in local regeneration and with the third sector for a very large part of my career, subject matter is one that's particularly close to my heart. It's tremendous to see community wealth now being given such prominence in policy and practice at both national and local government levels, as we look to build an inclusive economy that values and supports well-being. Now, I have to say from my own experience, this isn't without challenge. I've witnessed and experienced firsthand the tensions that harnessing the contributions of different partners can bring to this sphere. The public, private and voluntary and community sectors work in very different ways, have different cultures and different degrees of power in the working relationship, and this can be difficult to bridge. But community wealth building offers a tangible, effective and tried and tested mechanism to address this, so that all of who have a role to contribute, including those who live and work in local communities, play a crucial part. And at a time when economic and social well-being has been worsened by the impact of COVID-19, and we all await the fallout from Brexit, a collective approach has never been more important to tackling long-standing issues of poverty and inequality in our local communities, as is the need to keep investment circulating in the local economy. So I'm really delighted we have the expertise of Neil McEnroy, who's the director with the CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, with us this afternoon to provide a how-to guide on all that community wealth building entails. This is the first of 5 workshops being held from December through to March next year, offering both a refresher for those of you who attended the community wealth building sessions with EDAS, which we ran with CLES a year ago, as well as a more in-depth and practical look at how to plan and implement community wealth building in your local areas. During the sessions, we'll be guided by CLES's wealth of expertise and experience and very practical toolkit, as well as hearing from some of those working in the pilot areas where community wealth building approaches are currently being tested across Scotland. Our aim in all of this is not just to provide you with knowledge, skills and expert guidance, but to create a community that you can link into, build relationships with and have conversations with outside these events, so you have the support you need to take your ideas and aspirations forward. So just a few practical points before we start. As with all large events we're running, we've muted participants except for those who are speaking, but you can add comments or questions to the chat box, and I'd really encourage you to do this. We're looking to have a short break, around about 3 o'clock, but around about 2:50, all being well, we'll take some questions that we'll be gathering and accumulating and hopefully filtering through in the chat box and feed them into the discussion. We've also scheduled around 2 hours for this workshop today, but we know how busy everyone is, so we'll do our best to keep to that kind of time frame. So without further ado, I think that's all the practicalities. Can I hand over to Neil, who, as I say, we're delighted to have with us today. Okay, Neil.
Thank you, Liz. Good afternoon, everyone, and great to be part of this growing community wealth building community. So great. I've got some slides and we'll go through a bit about theory, we'll have some practice, I'll give you some examples, and I'm going to try and fit in a wee exercise that you're all going to do as well. So let's see how we get going. So a lot of talking from me, but hopefully keep the chat going, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions at 2:50 as Liz outlined. I'll share my screen now, so some of my colleagues can give a nice thumbs up if they can see that okay. Can you see that okay, Liz, Elaine, Alison? Yes? Give me a...
Yes, yes. I can see it, Liz.
It was muted there, Neil, but yes, I can see it fine.
Fantastic. Okay, so community wealth building theory, bit of practice and some examples, and we'll get going. I'm Neil McEnroy. I'm the Chief Executive of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and we are the National Organisation for Local Economies, or think and do tank. We're based here in Manchester, work across the UK. And our whole stuff is about progressive economics for people, planet and place. We're been 35 years old and we're a charity. So that's what we're about. Now, community wealth building. It's been going about 20 years and I think it plays into the condition that we're in at the moment in the world. Firstly, let's talk about climate emergency. And my daughter's lovely poster from Extinction Rebellion March was on, we have our ongoing climate crisis. So we need to think differently about how what goods we consume and how we consume them, shortening supply chains and so on. There's a major issue around this climate crisis. Also, though, and this is from the Financial Times from 2019, just before the pandemic, they told us, the great London Financial Times told us, capitalism, time for a reset, in a sense that capitalism was going a bit wrong, not only in climate terms, but also in terms of growing inequality, disadvantage, and how it wasn't really serving us particularly well, or as well as it could do. And then, of course, we've got this growing pandemic, which is part related, of course, to the climate crisis, or at least problems in the biosphere and problems with ecology. So we have this dreadful set of affairs, if you like, and community wealth building directly plays into what do we do about these ongoing crises and move to another situation in terms of our economy and how our society is run. Now, one of the key things we need to think about when it comes to community wealth building is the problem of growth. Our growth is exclusive, yeah? Now, the red line is GDP. This is UK figures. The red line is GDP, the pink line rather. The blue line is the poverty rate, and the yellow line is average income percentage of GDP. And you can see there what's the trends happening is that whilst GDP has been going up, though, obviously it's started in recent months, it's disconnected from poverty and it's disconnected from income. There's a relationship there, but clearly the more wealth we create in GDP, it's not actually landing in terms of addressing poverty, inequality, and income levels. In fact, income levels as a portion of GDP is going down. So there's a fundamental problem here around the idea that says, let's just get the growth and we'll be okay. Well, growth itself is not enough. We need to work hard on growth to make sure it truly delivers the benefits for our people and our communities. And again, how do we make growth work for our people and our communities is a key element to community wealth building. Now, this looks like a hell of a complicated diagram. It is in a sense, and it's difficult to get data on this, but this is the best we can get. What this is telling us is the portion of wealth that comes to us in the form of income, opposed to wealth that comes through owning capital and return on capital. Yeah. So opposed to return on investment, this is talking about income in terms of what comes to us in wages. Now, the first wee circle there is a low point, but it was a peak of industrial revolution in the 1850s. And to think about those times, the dark satanic mills, when there was poor unionisation, of all wealth, income was a very small proportion, just knocking 50% of all wealth got back to people in wages. The rest of the wealth were the people who owned the industry, if you like. They accrued a lot of the wealth. As we move through the years, you see in the second bubble on the right, you see the peaks of employment and income protection, unionisation, increase in wages, never had it so good years, if you like, Harold Macmillan. What happened then was that white income or wages became a higher portion of lots of wealth. More people received benefits from the income and wages compared to other forms of income as a return on capital and investment. But what's happened in recent times, and this is the big worry where community wealth comes in, of all the wealth we've got, we're seeing it slipping down in terms of wealth coming back to us in the form of income and wages. And more wealth is being extracted, if you like, through those who own capital and own, if you like, means of production. So there's a historic movement here between a low point in the Industrial Revolution when wages were low, high points when wages were high, and now wages lower in proportion to the wider wealth across our world. Now, where does the wealth go? Where is the wealth going? Well, we have seen this over concentration of wealth in that the 8 richest men in the world, if they were to realise their assets, would have the same wealth as 3.6 billion people across the world. We've never seen such concentration of wealth. Scotland is a wealthy country, but there's lots of poor people. There's an issue here about wealth and how wealth gets extracted. If there's nothing wrong with inward investment, there's nothing wrong with people making a buck, of course there isn't, but we need to make sure that as much of that wealth that does land in our localities sticks and works virtuously for our communities and our people. In UK, 5 of the richest families actually own the same amount of wealth as around 13 million of us. And in Scotland, it's something like 25% of us in Scotland have less than £500 worth of actual savings. So there's a huge disparity in inequality in wealth, and community wealth building in its own humble way seeks to try and turn the dial on this problem of wealth and the problems of extraction of wealth away from us and our communities. So, community wealth building, it's a people-centred approach to local economic development, which looks to increase the flow of wealth back into local economies and places by giving more control to local people and businesses. Now, many of you out there are familiar with economic development world, of course. It's a maturing of economic development with a core focus on hot wiring social, local economic, environmental benefits into all economic activity. Now, you'll be familiar with the notion of redistribution. This is the idea that we pay our taxes and that goes to the public sector, whom then make transfer payments back to us. Yeah. So there's that redistribution of wealth, and there's nothing that works perfectly fine, and that's good. Yeah. Keep on doing a bit of that. What community wealth building also says, though, is we're interested in the question of pre-distribution. This is the actual nature of when the economy functions before growth, before tax. How do we make sure the economy operates in ways where people are truly benefiting as the economy actually functions? In a sense, how do we give more of our communities a genuine stake in the community as economic production takes place? And there lies the interest in questions of preset ideas around work, fair work, and also ideas about who actually owns element of the economy. More of us should own more things, own more land and property, own more SMEs, own more community businesses, because that is pre-distribution. Not just wages that we would gain income from, we'd gain income by actually owning more of the economy as it actually functions. Pre-distribution. So community wealth building is redistribution, but it also says, let's think more about pre-distribution before wealth is created and that we actually have a stake in it. Now, there's nothing really new about all of this community wealth building. The key thing here is this intent on turning the dial and hot wiring these benefits into the economy and trying to do this at scale across many dimensions. Now, another way to think about this is to think about flows. Think about money and wealth is like our mountain burns and streams. Think about wealth flowing. Where does it flow to? Where is the tributaries moving to? Where does the flow of wealth move? Where are the streams, the burns, the reservoirs, the lochs, so people can get their hands on some of that wealth? The flow of wealth is fundamentally important to community wealth building. We're trying to say, how do we make sure that we can gather and harness some of that wealth more effectively before it scooshes away, if you like, to offshore tax havens, scooshes away to distant shareholders, scooshes away to rich men? We're nothing against it, shareholders, nothing against people making a buck, as I say, but how do we make sure we get more of that flow of wealth, like a hydrological system, so that we actually benefit from it? The other way to think about wealth is to think about, we kind of use the analogy of plumbing. Let's think about economic plumbing. Where are the leaks of the wealth? How do we make sure when we turn the tap it truly benefits our communities? How do we make sure we've got the basins, the sinks, where actually we can get our hands on some of that wealth? These are fundamental questions for community wealth building in terms of how we think of this flow of where money and resources go. Now, in Scotland, let's think about Scotland now. In Scotland, at this time, all nations across the world face the challenge of economic transition to a new industrial and economic future. Social inclusion within the ecological limit. Every nation, I travel, I'm familiar with lots of countries across the world and privileged to work in some of them, is that this is a key challenge we face at the moment. How do we move away? How do we make the transition to a prosperous future within ecological limits? Now, Scotland's past is characterised by large industry and geographic concentration of prosperity, of investment and jobs. The great industrial Scotland was built with a concentration of wealth, a concentration of activity, and there was truly benefits, if you like, in terms of that industrial welfare period of Scotland's history. Now, as we move forward, the future economy will be more distributed, more relational to place, more focused on planet, more focused communities. And we've seen through this pandemic how our working from home, our consumption patterns, these will maybe drop off a little bit when we hopefully receive the vaccine and we get back to some semblance of normality. But the idea of working in a locality, the idea of us having more of a local flavour to our economy, I think is here for good. And so the future economy must be more distributed, relate more to place and planet. And in that, the growth of SMEs and other forms of inclusive business ownership models is the future. And in that, the Scottish Government see the community wealth building under the auspice of wellbeing economy as part of that ambition and future. And drilling specifically into the programme for government and the Scottish Government aspirations, is that the Scottish Government see community wealth building as a practical and outcome-focused means to deliver on these wellbeing economy and inclusive growth aspirations, partly for the reasons I outlined. It will be guided by the National Performance Framework, an example of the National Performance Framework in action. And what community wealth building also offers, I think, Scotland, it's to simplify some of the complexity on the ground. There's lots of agendas, lots of great policy. How do we cut through some of that so we truly focus on jobs, enterprise, and giving a community more direct community stake in the economy? What the Scottish Government is doing in terms of practice, they're rolling out community wealth building in 6 localities. North Ayrshire started in 2019. There also now is an action plan for Clackmannanshire, which part 2 of this workshop series will cover next week. We're also working in the Western Isles, south of Scotland, Tay cities with a focus on Fife, and Glasgow City region. These 5 areas, 6 areas have been chosen because they are for Scotland to learn about the applicability of community wealth building, how it works in different places, rural and urban, kind of things we can test. So we're doing it, but we're also learning about the applicability of community wealth building to deliver on Scotland's wellbeing aspirations. There's action plans being produced. Clackmannanshire has been done. Fife will be, a draft will be done before Christmas, and then all of the action plans for the other 2 areas will be delivered by March 2021. Now, the methodology in these action plans is very much about actions, practical focus, with outcomes, real communities. Let's learn about them. Let's show how the outcomes we've made, then highlight and repeat. It's an appreciative inquiry method in terms of how we're adopting it. Also, Scottish Government are coordinating community wealth building across other areas of Scottish Government policy, how it links to health, how it links to fair work, how it links to procurement policy, how it links to land and property assets and so on, how it feeds into other elements of Scottish Government policy. And this kick-off, if you like, started in July this year, this kick-off, albeit North Ayrshire started earlier. Now, the other thing to convey in this community wealth building is the importance of anchor organisations. These are the large organisations who in some senses are not going anywhere. They employ a lot of people, they buy a lot of things, they have significant land and property assets. This particularly the public sector anchors, they probably contribute about 30–35% of the whole Scottish economy. And they are, in sense, partly owned by us, the people of Scotland. So it's important we think about what they do with their wealth, who they employ, what they'll do with their landed property assets, what they purchase. So in that, these are what we call in the business sticky capital. Yeah, sticky capital. They have financial, economic, intellectual, social and human capital that's inert in some way. It's not a global corporate who shareholders at a distance. The shareholders of public sector anchors are in a sense us. Yeah. So there's a inert nature to them, and we've got a duty to ensure that we extract as much as we can from them in terms of the wider community wealth that they bring. There's also, though, business and community anchors. Many businesses across the whole of Scotland have a deep affinity and relationship to this great land of ours. And in that, those businesses are also anchors. They're rooted in this place. They're not peripatetic. They're there and they contribute so much to our community. How can we do more in terms of what the community can deliver in terms of wider community benefits? And of course, what community anchors as well. Range of community organisations who, again, employ people, have land and property assets, and purchase lots of goods and services. So these are important. They're not everything about community wealth building, but they're important in dimension because of the nature of the wealth that they hold and the nature of how we can build a relationship with them to build up community wealth. And clearly our own community planning partnerships are kind of vital in starting to consider community wealth building. There has been particular attention placed in community wealth, though not exclusively so, on health institutions as anchors, and that slide there on the left, the bit on the left is from the Health Foundation, who've started to think through how health institutions themselves can be economic agents. This is a key point. They're not just delivering health outcomes, they actually play a role within the economy because they employ lots of people, they have lots of land and property assets, and they buy lots of things. And this movement around health institutions and education institutions is very big, including that example from the USA. Now, community wealth building has, what's going on here? Community wealth building has 5 key pillars. These are all dimensions of community wealth building that it's almost a way of cutting up the agenda. Community wealth building, these 5 pillars, and these are all elements of wealth, yeah? And trying to think differently about how that wealth in those 5 pillars are utilised in different ways for our communities. I'll go through them in turn in a minute, but you've got plural ownership of the economy, which in a sense is ownership. This is about SMEs, co-ops, community businesses, social businesses, this pre-distribution element. Let's think about how we increase the number of those types of organisations. The more of those organisations you have, the more likely you can build more community wealth because wealth is less extracted. Then you've got financial power. You've got things like credit unions, community banks, city deals. All that resource needs to work well for local people and local communities and local places. You've got employment, again, another great source of wealth, making sure we get as much as we can in terms of fair work for our citizens. Then we've got purchasing, procurement processes, how do we spend our money, particularly in our anchor organisations. And then in our land and property holdings, how making sure that communities truly benefit in wealth terms from those land and property assets. Now, the community wealth building is long-standing and it's been going for a number of years, about 12 years, 10 years in the UK, 20 years we started in America. And there's a number of localities across the UK, though not all of them, who are all involved in community wealth building. And we'll see these areas that are coming up in Scotland. Now, what's important about these locations that are doing community wealth building is the ones in green are doing all of those 5 things. They're focusing all 5 as a whole suite of activity. Almost it is the key economic strategy for the place. It covers all those 5 things in relation to community wealth building. and that's the ones in green. The other ones are maybe focused on one or two of those particular pillars for capacity reasons, perhaps, for priority reasons, for just what fits the local context reasons. They're honing it in on 1, 2, or 3 or 4, but not all of those 5 pillars. In Clackmannanshire, we are focusing on all 5, as in North Ayrshire. Tay Cities and Fife will focus on all 5. Glasgow City Region is only focusing on 2. They're focused on land, property assets and sustainable procurement. Western Isles are looking at all 5, but a very bespoke element to all of those 5. And south of Scotland, we've not yet decided exactly what would take place in south of Scotland, but probably there will be a focus for sure on 1, 2 or 3 of the pillars. North Ayrshire, as I said, does focus on all of the 5. Now, I've rattled through that quite quickly, in fact, much quicker than I thought, which is quite good. So I'm wondering at this juncture if there's any questions. We take questions now for 10-15 minutes, and then we'll get on to the pillars in more detail. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm disrupting the plan that we had, but that's no matter. I'm wondering if there's anyone has any questions or thought for now, before I continue on that general theory and general position of where community wealth builds in Scotland, before I drill down specifically into those pillars.
Can I just check? First of all, Neil, thanks very much. That was really comprehensive, and a really good summary, and a great refresher for those of us who, as I say, were involved last year. I'm just wondering logistically how we're going to do this. Elaine, can you just advise how many people do we have at the meeting? Because I was watching throughout there and we had people joining right the way through your presentation there, to be honest, Neil. So I'm just wondering how many we have, and if it's practical to ask people to put their hand up, because I'm not seeing, I was watching the chat box and I wasn't seeing too many questions. Well, I couldn't see any questions, to be honest. More comments from what I can tell. Oh, I think, are we still getting people joining? Let's see. Just having a look at the chat. I mean, one question.
So if we use the raise hand function or pick out from the chat, whichever people prefer, Neil can respond.
Yeah, I think what's happened, Neil, so far is I think people are probably listening to what you were saying rather than responding and putting questions in the chat so far. So do we want to try the raised hand? I don't know. Again, we'll just try and see if we can see this. It's a bit challenging. We've got so many in the room, but Elaine and Alison are on hand to try and manage that. Oh, I think we're getting a few more questions through now, are we?
There's some questions there. I'll just take one that I see, if I may, in terms of the overlap with the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. And I think, like, I would say that's from Kenny Richmond. Kenny, I think it's a good question. I think there's many supportive concomitant agendas across Scotland that are very in tune with community wealth building principles. And I think the 20-minute neighbourhood concept, particularly as regards goods and services and how they are at hand in terms of that 20-minute neighbourhood concept, is very important to community wealth building. There's also a heavy place element and function of place element to the 20-minute neighbourhood concept that's also significant for community wealth building. And there has already been conversation at the Scottish Government level with those people in charge of that concept or running or working through that concept. So there is good overlaps there, Kenny. Thank you for that. And there's a question about from Reid Hutchinson as regard community economic development and the links between that and community wealth building. There is strong historic links with community wealth building and community economic development. However, community wealth building focuses on all of the economy, not just the community economic element. It's looking more at the bigger mainstream elements of economic development, not just the community dimension. So it's an extension or a growth of the community economic development activity towards wider economic development questions is the connection there between community wealth building and community economic development.
Are you seeing the one below that as well, Neil?
From David?
There's a couple actually. There's one from David, one from Michelle. Can you see those?
Yeah, the one about why the areas and how the areas of Scotland were chosen. I think you could tell from the list that there's a mix of rural, urban, urban, rural. So it was very much a decision to kind of choose places which had a good mix, and we could get a good learning from those. We do know there's a number of areas, at least 4 or 5, who are also starting to progress community wealth building under their own steam, and that's good also. And obviously exercises like this workshop are important for that, and the growing community outwith of what Scottish Government are sponsoring. But very much it was just a blend to see across the different geographical location of Scotland, and so we get a good blend, so we can get good learning, and that's how they were chosen. Can
I just interrupt? I think it's the same person, David, at the very beginning. Neil also asked. He was just kind of doing a bit of an introduction, and he was asking. He was keen to learn more about how civil society, community-led initiatives can also contribute to community wealth building.
Yeah, I mean, in the actual action plan processes, the TSI and other bits of the community, voluntary and social enterprise sector are woven in. I think there's more to be done on that in terms of that bottom-up role, if you like, but it's certainly woven into the action plans to date and should be extended moving forward. But I think, to be fair, I think there's more work to be done on that agenda and making sure it's not. I think traditionally it's been quite structural, top-down economic strategy. I think that's necessary, but I think it also needs to be more grassrootsy as well, and linking more into our communities and our TSIs.
I think that possibly ties in a wee bit with some of my comments at the very beginning, where I was saying it's about working differently, isn't it? You know, in partnership, and there's a history about with the way different kind of sectors have worked, and we've tended to work in silos, and you know, we have to break some of that down, and part of the how-to, I'm hoping that we'll get into some of the detail of that as the workshops progress. Do we have any others? Sorry, no, I think you've covered them, haven't you? Yep. I'm sure we have anything happening on the. Oh, getting a couple coming through now. Social enterprise and cooperatives. Any insight into the extent which these types of businesses have a role in community wealth building?
These, what we call, you know, we'll get into it, but these plural forms of ownership are very key, and because as I said earlier, they're essential to this idea of pre-distribution. We know that that a small business owner or a social enterprise, they're going to have shape that they're going to owned by the people that run them, if you like, and so wealth is locked in. When they make a buck, wealth is locked in by the very ownership structure that they have, and so they are very key. I think the question from Paul was talking about how it sits with SG thinking. I think that is definitely a key part of Scottish Government thinking, and how we and I think through the community wealth building action plans, we will see good learning about how we can potentially amplify and scale up the role of social enterprises and co-ops within the economy, especially when it comes to anchor purchasing and how they can support that form of plural supply into the public sector supply chain.
Okay. Sorry. A couple more coming in. Let's do this.
There's a few questions coming in. How does things relate to other things? And I've worked across the UK on community wealth building now for 10, 12 years. And coming to Scotland, I would say my reflection is that I see lots of great policy and lots of great activity, but there is quite a lot of complexity on the ground. And I think what what is important action plans in localities is how do we sort of use community wealth to cut through and across some of all those different agendas so that there's a consistency and a unified approach of intent to do things with those great sets of policies. So we're hoping to cut through some of the complexity that I think is in there in Scotland, necessary complexity I think, but how do we kind of get cut through so there's real follow through in action terms with that great policy that's there, and I think Community Wealth Building aims to help with some of that.
I mean, that's a fantastic aspiration. I don't imagine it is an easy one, given the complexity you describe. But it does strike me when you were talking about all the different parts of government, even whether it's health or land or etc. I mean, there's so much potential if we could get everybody on the same page around what their contribution could be. I take it you'll be at early stages with that, Neil.
We're already seeing that in terms of the actions that's coming out of CLACS that we'll cover in the next session next week, and not so much today, about how the actions that are being posited for CLACS's community wealth building cut across and into some other policy agendas and how they can work synergistically together to deliver on community wealth building. So I think it's starting to come through, and I think it's interesting in England where there is less good policy, and community wealth building can act freer to some extent because it doesn't have lots of other policy agendas. So in that sense, it's easier, but it's also harder because it doesn't have the good policy. So we need to use the good policy we have and make sure that we're truly turning the dial on secure outcomes for our communities. And I think community wealth building helps to that little bit of focus and turning the dial and intent with the whole suite of policies in individual localities.
I'm noticing as well that Geraldine Campbell's come in from the Economic Development Division of Scottish Government, and she's saying about issuing letters of guidance as to how we can use these to set out expectations around community wealth building. Now, I'm not sure if that's just, I mean, I suppose it depends to the extent to the spread of that, if you like. Is that going to mainly local economic partnerships, the local authorities, economic development departments, or what? Where does that go? How widespread is that? Touching on the point that you're making.
Yeah,
embed it across different policy areas.
Yeah, I should say, I didn't say at the outset, I should say that I'm also part-time seconded to the Scottish Government 2 days a week, which I didn't say at the outset, and Geraldie's one of my colleagues. And I think those letters of guidance that I understand are to local authorities, but also I think wider players within the community planning partnership about expectations around community wealth building. And I think they will come as we move forward and are clearer from the learning from the action plans. I think it would be guidance which is snuggles with existing activity. It's not another set of guidance. It would fit with existing pillars of policy, if you like, rather than something that's completely new. It's very much not another set of guidance for another thing. It's guidance that fits in and how it relates to other elements of policy.
Okay.
Good.
A few more still. Friday.
This is working okay, isn't it, Liz? I think
so, yeah. I mean, in an ideal world, it would be great if we could hear people's voices, just because it's more engaging. But yeah, we'll keep going with this. We've got Bridie Ashrown, who's made a comment about makes sense. Can you see that one, Neil?
Bridie?
Yeah.
I know, Bridie. Makes sense. I think what I'm getting from Bridie's is that I think the new economy of the future will see a greater role for social enterprises, or enterprises that have a good relationship to place and the needs, wants and desires of our people. And there will be a circular element to the profits and surpluses accrued and how that flows through our communities. And so this should not be seen as a laudable, nice little thing on the side. Yeah, a nice. Oh, that's a good thing, but that's not the mainstream economy. Community wealth building is a direct intent to change how the mainstream economy actually functions. So we've always known about social enterprise and so on. It's to try and make that more mainstream in terms of how the whole economy operates, opposed to the social economy. The community wealth building agenda says, let's make the whole economy more social and ecologically just. So it's more ambitious than just saying let's have some more social enterprises. It's actually saying let's have the whole economy that's social. So it's not just a laudable initiative. It actually, these are seed beds that foreshadow a bigger change in how potentially our wellbeing economy should function in Scotland.
Yeah. Okay. Also, a good question coming in from Pauline Hinshin, saying, has spent many years trying to get CBC clauses scale introduced into procurement contracts, but of course struggling to get past procurement culture, rules and state aid. How does community wealth building resolve those barriers? Don't know that, that's a big question.
One of the things that I was so excited in embarking on this work was the actually fantastic sustainable procurement policy that Scotland has and the support mechanisms for it. And that is second to none in terms of many countries across the world. I mean, Wales has got good stuff, and New Zealand's got some okay stuff, but Scotland really has some brilliant sustainable procurement activities. I think how that relates to supply chains, how it is embedded in the culture of our public anchor institutions, I think these are questions that need to be resolved. But in terms of the policy and in terms of what we've got here, there really is fantastic. And I think that what Pauline's touching upon is the culture and some of the rules that could maybe be bent, or some of the interpretations of the rules that are maybe a little bit overly rigid in the interpretations. And we're looking at that as we go through the individual action plans, and also speaking to Scotland Excel about some of these things as well. So what's the space, Pauline, on that? It's a great question and comes up quite a bit, but it's I would say that broadly speaking, it's good policy. It's the practice and the supply chain we need to work on.
Yeah, yeah. There's one comment from Kenny Richmond, but I mean, as he says, we may be moving on to this, so I don't know if it's too early to talk about how success can be measured, either quantitatively or qualitatively. But is that something you want to address just now, Neil, or leave till?
Oh, come on, yeah, but I'll come on a little bit of that later on. But broadly speaking, it's very important that the realisation of the action plans are quite clear on what outcomes they would seek, particularly in terms of local jobs, and particularly in terms of businesses growing in the locality. So that I think clear outputs that you're heading towards are a key feature of community wealth building, and they are quantitative, but there's also qualitative tales as well in terms of the kind of progression we want inside our economy. So it's a good one, Kenny, and I will come on to it a little bit later on.
Okay, I think the next one's more of an observation. Do we have any? I noticed that Alison had said you'd like to ask a question in person. You can raise a hand. I don't know if we had any takers for that. Maybe Alison can advise me, Neil and I.
Who's going to be the brave person?
Who's going to break the mold with our events?
I certainly can't see any raised hands yet.
Oh, be brave.
I don't know if it's Reid or Hutchison. Is it Hutchison?
Oh, where are you looking, Neil?
Reid Hutchison had his hand up.
All right, okay.
Oh no, was that a thumbs up?
Yeah, that could be.
No, it is a hand.
Is it? Okay, can we get that? Can we bring in Reid? I can't see that on my screen, but...
Thank you for coming in. Fire on.
Okay, no problem. It was really the second part of my question, if it's okay, Neil. So just, I suppose now you're seeing some examples of the pilots, how do you kind of bring in both the political and senior management support in terms of community wealth building, along with, and it isn't just local authorities, obviously it's other community planning partners as well?
Reid, that's a brilliant question, and it's essential actually that political leadership is bought into this, and to date the political leadership is bought into it in the various pilot areas we're working in. It does need that heft. It can't just be seen as another programme, something else's responsibility. It has to be seen as a corporate culture of how you're operating. That's certainly coming from local authorities, and I think we're starting to see that emerging in the health boards and in the university leadership as well. And the community planning partners, or at least a subset of the community planning partnership that focuses on community wealth building, is something that we're very keen on pursuing and growing. In North Ayrshire, there's an anchor charter, which I can come on to later, which has all the major leadership of major anchor institutions in Ayrshire signing up to community wealth building and pledging to do certain things. So it is very, very essential that we get political and senior leadership buy into community wealth building, both at a local authority and in those other anchor organisations. Thanks, Reid.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any others? I can't see everybody on the screen as a part of the problem, so I'm going to need to get some advice on this.
What was that, Liz?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to, I can't see everyone on the screen so at the same time, so I can't see if anyone else is raising their hand. Alison, are you keeping an eye on this? Do we have anyone else?
No.
Can't see any more.
Right, okay. Neil, are you happy to kind of have a break just now?
Yeah, I think that would good for me.
Okay.
Let's have a 5-minute little break. Don't disappear, everyone. Just have a little 5-minute comfort break and come back at what? Well, 5 to the hour.
Yeah, 5 to
3. Yeah, it's a little break, little comfort break, and we're back, and we'll get into the pillars, and some of the case studies will come after the little break. Thanks for now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, everybody. See you shortly.
Let it go, Liz.
Yep, I think so.
Yeah, good.
Is everybody back? Do we think?
I think so. Let's go on.
Okay, let's just start.
I'll share my screen again. Oh, great. Open the wrong one.
Joys of technology.
Oh, to be virtually in real life together again, eh? That'd be great.
So we'll never take it for granted again, Neil.
No, can you see that okay, Liz?
Yep, that looks good.
Let me just go through where it was. I'm going to talk now just about these pillars and then get into some of the case studies from elsewhere. But the pillars, the first pillar then is workforce. And what we're talking about here in this pillar, remember these are all baskets, if you like, who are thinking about how do we make sure wealth truly benefits local communities and local people. And of course the workforce one, the tried and tested workforce agenda here. And you've got the Scottish Fair Work agenda, which is a fantastic piece of policy in terms of effective voice through unions, security in terms of work contracts, opportunity like women on boards, diverse representation, fulfilment as regards training and in-work progression, and also respect in terms of flexible working. A great policy agenda, and obviously community wealth building seeks to amplify, deepen, go faster with that fair work agenda. You've also got things like the Dundee 11 wage city. I think about 50 employers across Dundee, including the big anchor organisation in Dundee, signed up to an employment to 11 wage city. And then you've got other things like the Good Employment Charter in Greater Manchester that my organisation was involved in, CLES, where a range of different sign-ups with different levels of sign-up for different employers across Manchester signing up to certain things in terms of good employment and good worker relations. So there you have that first pillar. You're seeking in community wealth building to turn the dial on these policies, on these practices, to make sure that we make sure work is fulfilling, people get good pay and have fulfilled lives through their working lives, if you like, as well. Interesting as well, you've got things like Leeds Teaching Hospital Trust, developing local labour markets to grow the workforce in poorer areas, so they're targeting poorer areas or underserved sections of the population, particularly women, and that's something that Leeds Teaching Hospital's doing. A range of different things then around workforce, and there's a whole gamut of different things you could do.
Sorry to interrupt, Neil. Just I can see a slide that doesn't seem to correspond with what you're speaking to, because I've got a copy of your slides here.
Is it
so workforce? Conscious that maybe
is it workforce?
Maybe it's not quite in sync. There's one that's on workforce that I think is the one you're referring to right now, but that's not what's on your screen. You've got a screen. The one I can see is a kinder Cumbria.
Oh.
Which doesn't seem quite.
Is it moving now?
Nope.
Right. Let's again.
So if we could just maybe pause just for a minute till we get the technology working again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
No, they seem to have a. I think you think you're showing something about Cumbria, a project in Cumbria.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It's the wrong one. Hold on.
Yeah, sorry. I thought you were about to talk to us about something that was happening in Cumbria there.
No, that was my mistake. Sorry, folks.
No, it's okay.
What have you got now?
Don't have anything other than everybody in the room. Well, I can just see people. So we just need to see, yeah, that slide with workforce on it.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know what's going wrong here. Oh. Is it just me? You see me?
I can see you and essentially a view of a number of people that are in the room who've got their videos turned off. So, yeah.
Again.
Oh, don't worry. If Alison can maybe give some advice on this. got some advice coming in the chat room. Perhaps enable your video too, Neil, makes the show more animated. Oh, okay. I think if we can get the slides working, we'll be doing well. Focus on that first.
That's not working.
No.
Do you want to send them to me, Neil, and I'll share them?
Yeah, it's maybe easier that way. If you're able to do that. If we just take a pause for a minute, folks. Sorry about this, but we'll get the technology working imminently. So just enjoy another few sips of your coffee.
I'm going to go out and come back in again.
Yeah.
Right, that's what we do. Yeah.
Yeah, looks like we're getting there.
Neil.
Yeah.
Right. Is that, Leslie, that my slide?
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
On workforce, you've heard all that.
Yep. Cool.
Next one is land and property assets. Seen that, Liz?
Yep, can see that fine.
Okay. This is the second pillar. Sorry about that, folks. This is the second pillar around land and property assets. And again, we're seeking to turn the dial so that land and property asset holdings are benefiting communities as much as we can. And in that, we're starting to see, for instance, the Land Commission in Liverpool City region are looking at how do we advance publicly owned land to deliver local economic, social, cultural and ecological value for our communities, rather than just the thinking about their financial return. So this touches upon development activities. Development that's not just about financial return to the landowner, but thinking about how that can also benefit local economy, social, cultural and ecological uses. And you've got the great stuff going on in Scotland in terms of the vacant and derelict land agenda, Scottish Land Commission, and also, interestingly, from London Borough Islington, who are working on community wealth building. In Islington, you've got a situation where people are buying up things, it abuts the City of London. People buy property in the London Borough Islington and fill it full of, not don't need to fill it full of anything, and they still make a 20% return in a year. And so Islington's thinking, how do we actually start to think differently about this? How do we think about planning? How do we think about changing the nature of planning, viability assessments and so on as part of development processes, so that we can truly lock in community benefits and social value to that property development and speculation, if you like, so that it does benefit our local communities. And of course, in Islington, there's a massive shortage of community workspace, small manufacturing workspace. So they're trying to be strategically thinking as a council of how they can turn the dial to make sure that land and property assets benefit local communities. That's the second pillar. The third one is around the financial architecture, and we're seeing the growth of community banks, including the South West Mutual down there in the southwest. This is new banking legislation that allows the mutual banks to be set up. In Germany, you've got the Sparkassen movement, I think around over 400 community banks that are very much rooted in the local place, rooted in local communities, supporting local ingenuity, creativity, local business and so on. More relational aspects to the economy. Banks truly identifying with the local people, the local communities, local business needs and funding things accordingly. The GMPF is Greater Manchester Pension Fund. They have, I think, a £400 million pot that they've identified that is for local investments. So it's not just playing in the global markets for return, it's thinking about how do we actually use our public sector pension resources to actually benefit local investment and obviously the pension holders. And then in the Ayrshire growth deal, there's a desire to see how all aspects of the £3 million worth of Ayrshire growth deal to some extent play into ideas around community wealth building, particularly around procurement and particularly around the workforce. So it's a financial set of architecture that is truly working for the benefits of local communities. Credit unions are also something that community wealth building is interested in, and how we can beef up and give credit unions more oomph in our localities. So that's the third pillar in finance. The fourth one, a very, very important dimension, is this plural and democratic ownership of the economy. And this is about, as we talked about, social enterprises, community businesses, employee-owned businesses, and so on. In New York City, and the Deputy Mayor spoke at our recent summit on community wealth building, Phil Thompson, they see a key plank of New York's post-pandemic future is to build much greater sense of employee ownership models across New York City, and has an ambitious programme for achieving that. Also in Barcelona, we have an interesting social and solidarity economy plan, and they have an economic agency called Barcelona Activa, the economic development wing of Barcelona municipality, and they have a support mechanism for a dedicated support mechanism for all forms of plural and democratic ownerships, ranging from third sector organisations right the way through to cooperatives, mutuals, and so on. A dedicated, all-encompassing support mechanism with finance to go with it. So this is again seeing this ownership form as a key plank of community wealth building, and finding support mechanisms, policies, and financial architecture that truly makes them grow and amplify at scale. Now, there is a particular importance around this ownership model, in that we know that the more inclusive places of the world, the places that have higher levels of addressing poverty and less inequality, have a higher proportion of those types of not-for-profit businesses. If you have a high proportion of listed corporations, large global corporates, more likely the tendency is that wealth will be extracted. Now, there's nothing against those types of ownership models. It's just getting the balance right within a local economy, so that we have this blend of large global corporates as well as a whole plurality of different forms of entities with different forms of ownership. And we know that, and this is UK figures, we know in terms of procurement and local authority procurement of small businesses, we know that 63 pence of every pound spent with an SME is more likely to remain local. They're more likely to have local employees, they're more likely to have local suppliers themselves. And it's only 40p for every pound spent with a large firm. So there's a natural multiplier effect of looking after our small businesses and other forms of plural social ownership. And then the fifth pillar is around spending and public procurement, which I've touched upon. And this is worth perhaps up to 35% of our economies, of what the public sector anchors do, and also what they spend their money on. And again, this is a very old idea in terms of how we think about public procurement. And that little poster on the right is from 1854, and it's the Borough of South Shields, the Watch Committee, which I think was the committee that looked after the local constabulary. And it's a tender document going out from the Thomas Salmon, the town clerk. And what's interesting, though, in one of the clauses you can't see, but one of the bits it says at the 3/4 way down says the lowest tenders will not necessarily be accepted. This is not just about price. This is also about quality, and potentially also about the local supply chain and the local clustering of economic activity in that locality. So there's a key push here on this fifth pillar around how do we make sure that every single pound we've got truly benefits the community and truly supports local ingenuity and creativity. And in this, I think what we're talking about here procurement in the red line here is the red diagram on the left. It's kind of saying procurement is not just about getting the thing you need in a traditional sense. It's about thinking about procurement as wider investment resources. In community wealth building, we say procurement spend is economic development spend. Yeah, it can actually accrue so much benefits to a local community and a local place. So if we see it as investment, then we start to think about those wider community benefits that can be accrued from that investment resource. And of course, there's this cycle of procurement we need to think about that starts from the governance around these procurement commission activities, how we commission things and think about community benefits, how we think about that plays into pre-procurement in terms of the tender document, how it plays into procurement exercise, and then also how do we monitor, ensure there's compliance with these community benefits that we ask for. Now, there's certain questions we get asked around community wealth building. I thought we'd just touch upon some of them. People say, "Ugh, we're doing this anyway, we're doing it already." And I think for many of you, you are doing some of these things across these 5 pillars anyway. The trick here, or the intent here, is to deepen those activities around those 5 pillars and think about how they all relate to each other. For instance, a procurement exercise will also accrue benefit around a local workforce. They all relate to each other in some way. So it's about doing it with intent and strategically and cutting through some of the policy areas we have to create this concerted effort and oomph around community benefit, community wealth building. Some people say, well, it's all about procurement, local spending, buying local. Well, it is an element, but let's be clear here, folks. It's about all of those 5. It's not just about procurement. Procurement's important, but it may not be as important in other areas who are doing great stuff around procurement anyway. Those other 4 elements are important too. I think I touched upon this. People say, oh, it's just nothing for social economy or community development. No, as I said before, this is about trying to make the whole economy more social, the whole economy work for well-being, rather than thinking this is a sector inside a sector in the whole economy. No, it is the whole economy itself to make it more community wealth generating. Is it protectionist? Is it just talking about local? Well, I think the local's been a bit overplayed. I've said a lot here today about local. It's not just about the local. It's actually about getting more market entrants and stakeholders in the economy. It's increasing the capacity of local enterprise to bid for public sector contracts, but also grow themselves. It's about actually business development policy rather than seeing as very protectionist. Is it shuffling the cards, no new growth? No, it's very much about trying to increase the diversity and economic activity and the stake that communities have in that economic activity. And that should accrue new growth. We get new growth through clustering. We get new growth through diversity. And community wealth building is all about that. It's new growth too. And then some people say this is the small stuff. It's not the big ticket economic drivers. Well, I use that. I've often used it now, that Scottish phrase, mony a mickle makes a muckle. Many a small thing makes a lot. And so the many small changes we can make can actually make some big change. And I'll come on to that when I get into the case studies. I'll come back to that exercise in a minute. Let's do some case studies. And here's some stories here about what's happened as regarding community wealth building. The first one is from Preston in England that started with us and started in 2013. Now, what the story of Preston, how it began was that my organisation, CLES, were beguiled by the ideas of community wealth building. We felt it was a fabulous idea which we'd seen happening in Cleveland, Ohio, which I'll come on to in a minute. And we thought, how could we apply this within the United Kingdom? And Preston City Council were members of CLES, and we got a representative from the Cleveland, Ohio, Ted Howard, who is the Vice President of the Democracy Collaborative, over to the UK in 2012. And Preston City Council were in the audience, and they thought this community wealth building seemed brilliant. Why don't we do that? Now, at that time, they had a stuttering development process. They had a plan for the town centre of Preston, called the Tide Band Project, a £750 million redevelopment of Preston town centre. Now, because of the global financial crisis and a few other reasons, the Australian pension company, who were part of the funding of that development, pulled out, preferring Manchester, Liverpool, or even Glasgow, or the bigger cities rather than Preston. So they were left with a hole, a metaphorical hole in their economic development plans. So they thought, let's give community wealth building a go. And we embarked upon them starting with procurement. So what we did was, with Preston and 4 other anchors at the time, the college, 2 colleges, the registered social landlord and Lancashire County Council, mapped the spend of those 5 anchor organisations. At that point in time, University of Central Lancaster were not involved, though interestingly UCLan have now claimed they were involved, but they were not involved at the very outset. And we measured all their spend, and we found that there was very low levels of local spend and very low levels of social value accrued from that collective spend of £800 million. So through 2 or 3 years work with procurement departments of those 5 anchor organisations and the University of Central Lancaster when they came on board, we managed to repatriate £70 million more back to the city economy and £200 million back to the regional economy, that's the wider Lancashire. That was an estimate of around 1,600 jobs. It also meant, through stipulations in the contracts, that 4,000 more people were paid the real living wage. Now, since then, Preston have got onto the other pillars. They now have a cooperative development network run from the university. They now are using a pot of money from the Lancashire Pension Fund for a local hotel development. They're now moving quite fast with a community bank with Wirral Council and Liverpool Council and Lancashire Council. So they were the early adopters in the UK around community wealth building, and they're still started with procurement and then made big successes on that, and now moving to other elements of community wealth building. The second example I would bring is a more recent one from Wigan, Wigan in Lancashire. Wigan now have the deal for community wealth, and there is much more engagement with the community, direct engagement with the communities regarding their community wealth approach. They have some key aims, looking to increase 11% more spend with Wigan-based businesses. They're looking to use the £1 billion worth of public spending in their anchor partnership to increase the number of the workforce. There's a range of things they're seeking to achieve as part of the Wigan deal for community wealth, and that's just started the last 4 or 5 months they've been on that game. Birmingham is a different sort of approach, really, in that Birmingham started not from the council, though the council were key partners. It came from this group of 7 anchor organisations, the 2 universities, the Bourneville Village Trust, the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, the City Council and University Hospital Birmingham, and the registered social landlord, very much focused on what those anchors could do is regarding community wealth building. They're focused particularly on the workforce and how the NHS Trust has staffing shortages at the moment. Had staffing shortages, and now it's got worse because of the pandemic. And they're now looking to repurpose hospitality workers to the NHS healthcare workers, and linking that to the work to the Pioneer Housing Group, where they've seen a lot of their tenants were in threat of redundancy. They've also done something around procurement, where they're looking to create, in fact they have created now, a list of all the types of plural ownership models in Birmingham, and matching that to the anchor demand for all contracts below 25k. So for any contract that any of those anchors let that's below 25k, they're now seeking to go out to encourage the social economy, those inclusive ownership models, to apply for those goods and services that they're acquiring. So that's quite significant when you consider the amount of spending that goes through all of those organisations that's less than 25k. I did mention Cleveland before, and I think it was just worth mentioning that. It's been going much longer. And in Cleveland, a Rust Belt town in Ohio City, that had lost, I think, almost half of its population, or nearly half of its population, because of deindustrialization. And what they started from was those anchor organizations, particularly the hospital and the university. And they thought, what can we do to support our local communities? And so they thought about the goods and services they purchase, and they set up some worker-owned companies, starting from ground zero, really. They set up these 3 evergreen co-ops to hire local people and to do green development. So they've now got a large horticultural business, Green City Growers. They've got a a cooperative energy company, as well as a huge cooperative laundry facility that plugs directly into the laundry needs of the hospital. It employs 240 people. They all pay the living wage, the profit share scheme, and in 2017 they got $4,000, and also a sort of right to buy, or a home help, helping people to buy homes. So that link between those anchor institutions, those companies, were very important in this Cleveland model. And of course, they had these municipal government, the community foundation, and this technical and financial assistance to help these worker-owned companies to be set up and finance them. A large foundation, a community foundation, helped the startup of some of those cooperative businesses. So you can see this sort of virtuous circle has happened in Cleveland. I mean, we don't have these situations quite so gravely in Scotland, but nevertheless, you can see the ambition of how they, in a sense, remade the economy through community wealth building in Cleveland. Our very own North Ayrshire started in 2019. They now have an action plan. They now have a community wealth building commission. They're encouraging local businesses to explore local supply chains. They're reviewing land and property assets. They're looking to grow community ownership. They're exploring the idea of a community bank. They now have an anchor charter. They're covering all the dimensions of community wealth building, and they have an impressive suite of ambitions for the council, as well as, obviously, as I said before, being woven into the growth deal for Ayrshire. The London Borough of Newham, it covers the site of the Olympic Stadium, and huge inequality issues in Newham, huge poverty issues in Newham. They have a full plan, a full community wealth building plan, woven into their economic strategy. They now have a director for community wealth building. They now have set up a municipally owned development company called Popular Living, which is 50% owned by the local council. They now have a commission for participatory democracy, which links to this community bottom-up end of things, where they actually have citizens' assemblies and other ways where the communities generally have a stake, not just in public services, but seek to have a stake in the economic direction of Newham, and a say over inward investment and the type of procurement and other workforce initiatives as part of that. So very much a trailblazer in London, and of course that's now spilling over into a pan-London conversation about the role of anchor networks particularly, and there's a growing interest with the Mayor Sadiq Khan on the possibilities of community wealth building. He's up for election in May. Right, that's the case studies. I'd like this question, we have to take questions on that, but I'd like you to individually, if you would, just look at this exercise here. And what I want you just to do, and I want you to feed back on this, just think about your own organisation, maybe a council, it might be a health board, it could be from a university or a community organisation. Just think about your own organisation across these 5 pillars, with one additional question about awareness of community wealth building. So, is your organisation aware of community wealth building? Is it part of your economic strategy? Has it been discussed as part of your community planning partnership? Is it part of your corporate thinking? No, yes, or a little. Land and property assets. Have you think about community land trusts? Have you moved beyond asset transfer? Are you thinking about wider social, cultural, ecological value considerations in your developments? No, yes, or a little. Anchor purchasing. Are you thinking about spending supporting social enterprises, community businesses? Is your community benefits activities very robust? Are you market shaping in terms of commission of services? Again, no, yes, or a little. In terms of finance, do you thinking about local pension funds investment, thinking about mutual or community banks, thinking about how we can grow the credit unions? Again, no, yes, or a little. Workforce, real living wage, employment charters, fair work. Is it being considered? No, yes, a little. Plural ownership, SMEs, co-ops, municipal ownership, insourcing and creative economy. Again, no, yes, or a little. This is just a kind of little exercise for you to start thinking as a community wealth builder, and just to see kind of where you think you are in your own organisation. So we can, I'll keep this up. If you can get cracking on that, and then we'll have a little discussion about that and any other questions when we come back. So let's say, what, 5 minutes just to do that exercise? Yeah? Everybody okay? Good. I'll stop sharing the screen. People getting on with that? Do you want me to share that screen again? Oh, let me go back to the document.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful to see that on the screen.
On the screen.
Neil, yep.
Oops. Yeah, everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Good. 5 minutes and then we'll come back together.
Okay.
Oh, gold. Okay. That little exercise was a little window into some of the activity that takes place as part of the action plan in terms of a full review of all the areas of policy across the 5 pillars, as well as what you're doing anyway, and then seeing what we could potentially do more of, or what things you're not doing we can actually start to introduce as part of your role as an anchor or as a council locality as a whole. Is there any questions or comments like before that we'd want to pick up on? Let's have a little look. There's a question about how local is local, and I think that's a good one, Liz, from Laura. And I think, you know, the key point here is that you're looking for community benefits or ownership models, no matter where they're from. The local is used as a kind of proxy for community benefits, but I think we shouldn't get too hung up on the local. I think you're wanting to increase the amount of potential local suppliers, and then they would bid. But I think you'd want all areas to think about increasing their range of organisations and ownership models that can actually plug into our procurement supply chains. So a due consideration of local is correct, and consideration of what is local. But also you could think about areas that are particularly disadvantaged or a particularly under-representation of some businesses bidding into contracts from particular localities. I think it's important to note, but I wouldn't get too hung up on just focusing always on the local. Thank you for that question, Laura.
There's a good sorry, I managed to turn off my chat there, which is why I was just desperately trying to look to see what was there, but back on now, and I'm noticing there's a couple of questions and a couple of comments. Good one on climate change and the climate emergency, and have you recalibrated any of the pillar descriptions to incorporate any of that dimension? And also I think there was a comment above it where they were saying that Ayrshire's taking on a pillar around low carbon. So just any reflections on that? Yes,
Ayrshire did have a 6th pillar, if you like, around low carbon specifically. I think and that's perfectly good and excellent. I think we see the climate emergency and reducing size of length of supply chains is woven into all of the other pillars, if you like. It's like a golden thread that runs through them all. There is Claire's working to see how the Green Industrial Revolution and the Green New Deal ideas dovetail with community wealth building, but it's clearly something that's interwoven and connected, I think, is the short answer. It's interesting that in Wales, on the question from Tolic D about sustainable development goals, in Wales, the community wealth building work in Wales is driven by their well-being indicators, and they have 47 well-being indicators, and all of those are subsets of the sustainable development goals. And so what is being asked for as part of the social value activity in Wales vis-a-vis the procurement and community development activities is driven by the well-being action plans that all of the community planning areas, or they're called PSB areas in Wales, are adopting. So community wealth building fits underneath the well-being economy indicators, which are driven by the OECD Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, I'm also looking, Neil, I don't know if you spotted this one. There's one from Andrew Cook. He's actually got 2 questions. I suspect the first one was partly covered by your previous response on what is local and why local is important. If I move to the second one, which is a kind of a really big question.
Could a lot of ambitions around community wealth building be realised more effectively through changes in government policy and law, as in, progressive and higher tax changes in terms of wealth and income and the redistribution of that? Again, just wondering what your thoughts are on that. I mean, I won't give my own.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a role for deeper and harder fiscal policy at a national level as regarding supporting community wealth building, and it's one of the advantages that American cities have, as do some European municipalities have in terms of their fiscal powers. So there is something around that, and that would help to turn the dial, if you like, on community wealth building. But nevertheless, we would still have to have the sub-circulation, if you like, of wealth within our localities, and you would still need to consider questions of workforce, questions of business ownership, and so on as part of that redistributive policy. So you do need to have strong redistribution and strong pre-distribution working together, and the more you have of both, the better, really. But redistribution on its own will not in a sense be sufficient to on its own to grow community wealth building.
Would you argue that community wealth building on its own equally wouldn't be enough to transform the economy? With such measures as that kind of fiscal redistribution? Well,
it's interesting that in the larger, and it's an aspiration, of course, that community wealth building becomes a key practical means of delivering the well-being economy for Scotland. So in that sense, it should have that ambition to be able to turn the economy round to be well-being, to be more socially and economically, ecologically just. It's interesting, the conversations in administrations like New York, where the conversations around community wealth building are very much seen as, look, we get this to work, and then it will infect their word, or it will start to change the way that the mainstream big bits of the economy function. And they're really starting to see that in parts in terms of corporate social responsibility and changes to corporate governance in response to demand for employees having more of a stake. So the Blasio administration in New York is very ambitious and see it as a starting point to something that would truly start to make a transition within the wider mainstream economy. And in part, Scotland still has that ambition. Otherwise, it wouldn't have a well-being economy aspiration, which again is, in its true form, very ambitious in terms of turning the economy round into who it works for and how it works within planetary limits.
I suppose we're heading into some quite interesting territory in the next few years as well, in terms of our constitution and what the future holds and what powers we would have in that regard as well. And then we could get into all the issues around land ownership, etc. So it's a big question, but it's an important question. And I think probably in an ideal world, I would imagine having both would be the golden prize in a sense.
No, you're right, Liz, and no, you're spot on. And I think that the part of the community wealth building role within the Scottish Government is to start those conversations. I mean, it's held within the Economic Development Directorate, and to have those conversations of how it plays into a wellbeing economy and the future economic strategy, if you like, for Scotland. So it is starting that conversation, I think rightly so.
I actually had a question. I'm going to scroll down and have a look, see if there's any more. I had a question, Neil, when you were talking about Cleveland, and it probably goes back to, I think there's an earlier question about measuring impact. Cleveland, obviously, it began in, I think, back in 2009. So that, we're over a decade now into that approach being taken over there in the States. What's the, I mean, has the impact of their approach been sustained then in that longer term period? I mean, it's probably the example that you would have the longest, measures to be able to track. It's not just the initial success, but actually is that sustained over a longer period of time? Do you know how that's looking now?
It's had its ups and downs because of the ongoing problems of city finances and the ongoing travails of the society of Cleveland that went through is going through a catharsis, a long catharsis in terms of the massive problems of unemployment and destitution, But it is sustained now. Those co-ops stand right at the heart of it. In fact, they now export lettuces all across all across the USA, even to California. So if you have somebody said if you to such an extent, if you're going to have in California have a lettuce, you're probably likely to have the huge big spaces, dozens of greenhouses, all full of lettuces. It's a massive operation. So it is sustainable, and that has been the biggest success. Whether it's turned around the wider economy to a massive extent, there's massive structural economic issues there that's feature of what Cleveland was there for, its initial economic purpose and what it is now. But certainly the evergreen co-ops have sustained and endured and getting bigger all the time.
Okay, and is any of the learning then from Cleveland able to inform the kind of measures that will be used over here, the indicators?
Yes, indeed, and I think the biggest lesson from Cleveland is the role of the anchor organisations, the real intent, and this embroidery of community wealth building, if you like, linking up supply with demand, and then really trying to change what supply is and how supply functions, particularly setting up the laundries and the market garden activity. That's really, playing around with public sector demand and then really thinking deeply about supply and linking those two together. Big lesson there.
Yeah.
And I know the Scottish Government as well, on the case with PPE experience of how to link public sector spend to the Scottish business base and emerging Scottish business base.
Okay. I'm looking through the chat, Neil, and I'm not seeing more questions as such. A lot of comments and links to useful, kind of other resources, etc. All of this we're going to capture. I should let everybody know. Everything today, all the slides, all the the content, everything's been videoed, and the chat box will all of that can be shared with everybody. So don't worry if you're desperately trying to scribble down some of these issues. Are you wanting to move on to any feedback on the people's attempts at the action plan, Neil, or do you want to play this?
No, that's fine. No, we've got 15 minutes, and just to think any feedback from that, and just I wonder if somebody was brave enough to stick their hand up and just say how they filled it in and what they felt. I mean, it's a very light exercise, but I'm just intrigued by the extent to which people feel they're doing some of that, and what would be the next steps to do it with more intent and amplify it. Does anyone want to jump in? Go on, please, someone pop in.
Yeah, Save is testing our eyesight in the chat box here.
Hands up. No. Oh, Nikki, Clegg. Oh, no, Nikki. Nikki, hello.
Hi, Neil. Hi. I'll try and come in.
Go on, Nikki. Fire on. Did you do the exercise?
So I've had a quick attempt at the exercise, yes, and I've worked my way through it. Now, I think this comes back to the indicators and measures. How you would evidence we're doing this would be something for discussion. Probably just say I work for Clyde Gateway. We're an urban regeneration company covering parts of the East End of Glasgow and neighbouring South Lanarkshire. So as I've worked my way through this, I'm very conscious that part of that measure of success will be what your partners and what your community themselves will say has been the measure of success, and whether or not they think you have built wealth or whatever the measure is that they're indicating. So as I've gone through, I don't know if you want me to go through line by line, but I've went through it and I've said, yeah, I think we're covering quite a lot of this. However, there are areas where we are looking to do it more in depth, and certainly areas where we've just skimmed the surface. Nice. And that's either because it hasn't been a priority that the community have brought to us, and I think part of that community wealth building is about that shared discussion round about what matters most, what matters to me, if you put it in health terms, and Harry Burns, when he talks about what matters to me, is really important there. So the areas where I think we need to develop further, and obviously with yourself and colleagues, would be round about certainly the sort of a finance, working with our credit unions in particular, looking at the community banking model and what that means to local businesses and local communities and how we can get behind that. Part of that has been round about working with maybe colleagues within the academic sector as well, and talking about that economic democracy and the indicators round about that some of our colleagues in the University of Glasgow are looking at. And then the other one to maybe focus in a bit more for ourselves would be that plural ownership. that you've got in there, and certainly around about cooperatives and social enterprises, and getting a better understanding of how we can work more collaboratively and look at co-production, and we can look at some of the things, the co-ops that you've been talking about, and make most of that. So if I was to mark ourselves in terms of this, there's areas where we're doing not too bad, could do better, and areas where I think we really need to up the game. Hopefully that's helpful.
That is helpful, and again, I think what you say, Nikki, and you do great work there at Clyde Gateway, I know, is that there's something about how they all join together, isn't there, and how they all, you know, fit together, and then also the point about that co-designing, I think, part of that with communities in terms of what they would wish in terms of the outcomes and in measurement of that. So that's good, and I think there's also reminds us that this is not new, but it's about just more intent and lifting our eyes to think, okay, all these things, if we get them all going, then we really could start to turn the dial and make a difference for people like Clyde Gateway or communities there. So, no, it's good. Anyone else want to come in? Just any thoughts on that?
I was just going to say to Nikki, it sounds like we're looking for an input from her. Or from Clyde Gateway.
No, that would be good.
Stage, you know?
Maybe hear more about Clyde Gateway in later workshops. That'd be good, because they do great stuff. You'd be up for that, Nikki?
Sorry, Nikki, you're on mute. Don't know if you can unmute yourself.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think Neil and I are catching up later in the week, so we can discuss that then. Thank you.
That's it, Nikki. Cheers. Anyone else? No. Well, David. David, unmute David.
I know that Bridie Ashrown has had to leave. In her current role at Space Run House Community Centre, she's been working with hyperlocal groups, looking at ways to really ask what the local community want and need, and is very keen in the rather large southwest locality in Edinburgh, just one quarter of the city, how within that locality it's possible to apply some of these ideas, these concepts in this from the bottom up, so that it's practical implementation of often small things which can combine with participatory budgeting and so on. You can genuinely move to co-creation of solutions rather than talking at the top and bringing ideas down. I flag that to you because I know that she would value some of those inputs in her work there.
David, that's a good point, and something not touched upon there as much as we should have, but just to say that part of the theoretical underpinning of community wealth building, it's got one tradition that's the big economic strategy. Yeah, it's the big change. Yeah, it's top down, it's strategic, it's technical, it's the big things that happen in terms of what stewards our economy. The other tradition very much comes from that bottom up and comes from communities and the hyper local and the energy of people and the ingenuity of people. And in that, it takes inspiration from the guy, a Brazilian philosopher called Roberto Unger. And Roberto Unger tells us that what the hyperlocal does, it foreshadows the bigger change. So there should be and always will be, I think, a dimension of community wealth building that focuses on that very micro and hyperlocal. Because what you can do there could foreshadow bigger systemic change. So we need both, bottom up, top down, and we also need these smaller examples, I can say that actually herald or give us a glimpse into what the bigger change may look like. And we're trying to be that a little bit into the Scottish pilots with the focus on the place, local area partnerships in Fife, for instance. I think there's 7 area partnerships in Fife, and focusing more at that micro level a little bit. And I know there was talk today in the south of Scotland with the Scottish Borders Council of something similar potentially. So I think we do need to think about the micro and the hyper local and the smaller activities that can actually give us a little glimpse into what bigger change could be made.
Can I just ask a quick kind of supplementary to some of what's been said there, Neil? Just because it just came into my kind of thinking there that a number of years ago I was involved in a big initiative called Reshaping Care for Older People, big transformative program, health, social work, you know. So again, similarly ambitious, but with a different focus, if you like, to community wealth building. The big I suppose one of the big aspirations was to again try and instigate a way of working that involved co-production, that, you know, you had all of these players who, you know, had different levels of, in previous times, seniority. We were all meant to be on a kind of level playing field, and getting in a room and really starting to kind of plan different ways of delivering care with older people in the room as well, you know, with people who are recipients of care. It was a very different approach. It was a very new way of working for an awful lot of people involved. And we actually had, you know, experts coming in co-production to help people to understand how to work in a different way. And I just wonder, is that part of what you do? Is that part of your thinking? Is there any kind of almost guidance as to how to work differently? Because, you know, it doesn't necessarily come naturally to maybe the way that people have tended to work in other on other projects or in their particular spheres and sectors up to now.
And that's a really good point, really good question and thought. And we're familiar, because of the Christie Commission, you know, with, you know, the citizenry getting more involved in co-design of service and playing a role in service. And you know, that public sector reform agenda has got a tradition of that user involvement and co-design. Community wealth building is interesting in that as a method, and it's really important, but tries to place that kind of thinking in the economic dimension. Yeah, so it's that it's to try and pluralize, get the community more involved in the having a stake directly in economic strategy. And then that's interesting in London Borough of Newham, where the big economic strategy for London Borough of Newham is appreciates that when they're deciding what they're going to do with certain streets, what they're going to do with certain types of cluster industry, that form of community ownership is kind of key in the design of the parts of their economic strategy. Also, London Borough of Islington is a fashion street called Fontwell Street in the London Borough of Newham, which was threat of development, threat of park demolition. And the council stepped in and has been working with those local creative fashion, those small creative industry fashion companies, small culturally specific fashion development, to try and create a little cluster around that and co-design an economic strategy for that area with them. And I think that's the sort of thing that borrows from that Christie Commission and that sort of more public service stuff, but placed within the economic realm. And that's what I think that's what we're trying to do more of in community wealth building wherever we can.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Unless there's anything else, I think, is there anyone else comments?
I think there are various comments. I don't know if there are any more questions, Neil. So
I think Paul Morris says quite a few things about Glasgow, which is really helpful in the terms of the range of things that Glasgow's already doing vis-a-vis this agenda. And I know that Glasgow itself, though not a pilot in its own right as part of the Scottish Government action plan process, are moving ahead with community wealth building, and there's a lot of things that they're already doing that they would seek to amplify and scale up, and Paul's touched upon some of those great things that Glasgow's already doing.
Can I just very quickly ask on that, because you mentioned when you were going through the different areas, you mentioned that Glasgow had chosen, was it 3 of the pillars and not all 5? I think most of the other areas are taking on the 5. Do you know what the rationale for that was, or?
Well, it was partly us, the Scottish Government, deciding what best to focus on in Glasgow City region, not Glasgow City Council. Right. And, you know, obviously, to focus on one of the areas across all of the 5 pillars would be problematic, given the not problematic, but you need to do it for them all. So it's felt that we wanted something that was Glasgow City region specific. And in that, because of capacity reasons, we honed in on the vacant and derelict land and sustainable procurement and construction. But that doesn't preclude any of those other Glasgow City region local authorities and anchors to do things on their own back, as they are do at Glasgow as well. Glasgow, I know, as are South Lanarkshire.
Okay, I can see David. Is it David Somerville's got a hand up again? Yep.
Well,
David, do you want to come in?
Neil, I think what would be most helpful for those of us who've followed this for a little while is to sort of get a glimpse of the sort of inside track of how over the next year or two, how long you're seconded for, what you're hoping to do, and then others can see how we can pitch in or contribute, or if it's not, you're not planning to do something, then maybe do it elsewhere. But it would be very helpful just a little bit open the lid a little bit on what your thoughts are. Maybe you could do that more next session, and to sort of take us through the aspiration. It's been really interesting hearing about the other 5 areas, obviously beyond North Ayrshire. But what your dreams are, you will have achieved by the end of your secondment.
That's nice, Dave. That's a good segue into, I think, the next session. We would cover a bit more of that, I think, and subsequent sessions in the new year. So, and that, thanks for that, David, and supportive comments too. So, thank you, Liz. Are we ready to wind up and perhaps just?
We are, and I think we're absolutely spot on time, which is fantastic. So can I just say thank you to, first of all, to Neil, obviously, for a really excellent, interesting and informative session this afternoon. Obviously, I want to thank Elaine and Alison in the background who've been keeping the technology going. And apologies for that slight blip in the middle, but we got back on track really quickly. And also to you, all of you, because you're busy people, so we really do appreciate you taking the time to come to these sessions. And really, all I want to say is just, please, I'm assuming you've registered, you're coming back. Our next session is on the 15th of December. So we really look forward to seeing you next week. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And we'll speak to you soon. Take care.